What is socialism? If you ask the average American above the age of 35, basically anyone conscious and tuned in during the Cold War, they'll probably tell you it has something to do with a state exerting totalitarian control over its population, and then point to a country like China or the USSR, or even, in extreme circumstances, Nazi Germany, and leave it at that. In essence, people like this equate socialism to quote-unquote big government, high taxes, poverty, forced income equality, and what they perceive as liberalism. Ask a younger American the same question, and they'll be more likely to mention policies like universal health care and free education, and then point you towards contemporary politicians like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the rest of the so-called squad, or maybe to some of the Scandinavian social democratic countries like Sweden and Finland. Ironically, this first type of person we mentioned, the Cold Warrior, and this social democrat type actually have very similar understandings of socialism. The only difference being that the former views the term in a negative light, while the latter views it more positively, while not actually going as far as to call themselves a socialist in most cases. If you manage to find one of these younger Americans who identifies themselves as a socialist, they would probably be able to poke holes in both of these aforementioned definitions, rejecting the comparison to totalitarianism while simultaneously rejecting association with the more contemporary liberal social democracies. Many would disavow countries like China, the USSR, Cuba, Vietnam, and the like as not being representative of real socialism, and many would do the same for the Western welfare states as well. Some might defend the establishment of the governments that call themselves socialist in these countries, saying things like, oh yeah, the Russian, Chinese, Cuban, etc. revolution was socialist at first, but after blank took power, or after blank reform took place, it wasn't socialist anymore. Some, after rejecting these countries as being socialist, when pressed further on the matter, might point towards other attempts to establish more libertarian socialist orders. They might speak highly of the early anarchist rebellions in Ukraine prior to the Red Army takeover, or maybe they'll mention the Republican fighters of the Spanish Civil War. Many will praise the legacy of trade unionism and the IWW. Some of the more nerdy will point to the utopian socialists of the late 1800s like Proudhon or Bakunin, while the more intelligent will refer to some of the Western Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg or even the dreaded Karl Kautsky. But in all of this, one consistency exists. That being the total unwillingness to identify socialism with the legacy of successful socialist revolutions, instead opting to identify with, well, the losers. Some may criticize these claims, saying things like, oh, so you're just saying might makes right. Just because they didn't succeed or just because they failed to establish lasting power in their struggles does not invalidate the ideas that they had. Why should we identify socialism with the socialist states that actually won power for themselves? I like the ideas of the ones who failed better. What is happening here, in most cases, is rooted in the failure to accept the resolution of a debate that has gone on far longer than it should have. That being the debate between an idealist understanding of reality and a materialist one. A debate that, fortunately for us, was resolved by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels over a century ago. In Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy from 1886, Engels beautifully differentiates the two modes of thought. The great basic question of all philosophy, especially of more recent philosophy, is that concerning the relation of thinking and being. The answers which philosophers gave to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primacy of spirit to nature comprised the camp of idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belonged to the various schools of materialism. In more simple terms, the idealist believes that spirit, or ideas, take precedent to nature, or material reality, while materialists believe, correctly if we take Marx and Engels seriously, that it is nature, the existing material reality, that shapes ideas. To many this may seem like philosophical gibberish, but let's break down how this distinction manifests itself in contemporary political discourse. The self-proclaimed socialists that we mentioned before, the ones who refuse to define their socialism by the existing successful socialist experiments, do so often with the justification that these experiments do not align with their definition of socialism. That definition usually being some variant of the phrase worker ownership of the means of production, which they contrast with capitalism, which they define as private or individual ownership of the means of production. In essence, they first conceptualize what they think socialism is, what ideal vision of society they find preferable, and then desire to impose that idea onto material reality. In doing so, they often judge political movements of the past and present on the basis of their professed ideas and how closely aligned those ideas are with their own. This logic is exactly the kind that Marx and Engels devoted their life's work to criticizing. The opposite tendency, the materialist one, can be simply described again with a quote from Marx's Feuerbach, Opposition of the Materialist and Idealist Outlook. In it, he states, "The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. In this conception of reality, the idea is second to material existence itself. Thus, the Marxist conception of change cannot be rooted in good ideas. It is not our ideas which form the basis of social change, but rather a development in material conditions that does so." Another long quote from Marx might serve to clarify this position. In A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy from 1859, Marx writes, "I was led by my studies to the conclusion that legal relations as well as forms of state could neither be understood by themselves nor explained by the so-called general progress of the human mind, but that they are rooted in the material conditions of life. The general conclusion at which I arrived, and which, once reached, continued to serve as the leading thread in my studies, may be briefly summed up as follows. In the social production which men carry on, they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material powers of production. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which rise legal and political superstructures, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production in material life determines the general character of the social, political, and spiritual processes of life. It is not the consciousness of men that determine their existence, but on the contrary, their social existence determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production in society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work before. From forms of development of the forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. Then comes the period of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, the distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological, forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Let's break this down. What are the material forces of production, and what are the relations of production? The material forces of production can be described as the means, varied in complexity as they may be, that society uses to produce the goods that it requires to sustain itself. Examples being factories, agricultural plots of land, and the various tools utilized by those industries. The relations of production can be described as the way in which these forces of production are organized. Examples being the capitalist model of ownership, in which private owners dictate the terms by which the forces of production are utilized, specifically with the end goal of increased profits. And, in contrast, the socialist relation of production, which is characterized by the forces of production and their utilization being directed by social necessity. Social revolutions, Marx theorizes, spring out of the violent contradiction between the development of the forces of production and the system by which these forces are organized. Just as the agricultural revolution led to a reorganization of social relationships in the form of the development of feudalism, The Industrial Revolution allowed for the gradual casting off of these feudal relations in the form of the establishment of bourgeois democratic republics. And similarly, the monopolization of the industrial economy laid the groundwork for what would become socialism. The various social revolutions associated with these material developments, rather than instigating change in economic structures, merely reorganized the relations of production, which these material forces came into conflict with. If these elements have not reached the point of irreconcilable contradiction, generally taking the form of social and economic collapse, there will be no revolution. This scientific and materialist approach to understanding social change stands in sharp contrast with how many modern socialists frame their political action. Many of this group emphasizing the need for revolution, or even their own personal desire for revolution. But these socialists would be hard-pressed to find a single revolution that has transpired in this idealist way. The truth of the matter is that the most successful revolutionary parties are the ones who explicitly cast off such ideological distinctions and focus on organizing to meet the needs of the population in a substantial way, educating the people to better organize themselves to meet those needs, and, when contradictions between the existing relations of production and the productive forces themselves come to a head, agitating the people against the defenders of said relations in favor of building ones more suitable to the existing productive forces. One must note that the original slogan of the Bolsheviks, peace, land, and bread, was not based on abstractions, but material needs that were not being met because of the existing social relations, but which could be met by the actual productive forces of society, were those relations changed to better suit said forces. Peace, or an end to Russian involvement in the First World War, was a popular policy, and the only thing standing in the way of its realization was the system of czarist control over the military and the resources of society. Land ownership, at the time concentrated into the hands of a few nobles, landlords, and some wealthy peasants, was incapable of being reformed and redistributed as long as these same people exercised political power exclusively, despite the general population's support for such measures, the majority of Russians at the time being landless peasants. And finally, the demand for bread, calling for an end to widespread hunger and food shortages, problems that were inarguably linked to the other two aforementioned issues, with many food resources being exported to fuel the war effort, and a substantial amount being consumed by a class of idle, non-productive landowners and nobles. All of this in a climate of the beginnings of industrialization and rapid technological development that rendered any need for the parasites of the old order, the Tsar and the nobles, entirely superfluous. Society could be organized in a different way, and when crisis took full hold of the country, the revolution, instigated by the working masses themselves, not any one party, opened up the path towards this radical reorganization. The Socialist and the Bolshevik Party led the charge not because they recognized the need for revolution and advocated for it or instigated it, but because they were the political force that best assessed the needs of the population and organized to meet those needs most effectively. And they won. They successfully seized power and organized a government that was rooted in an alliance between the small but growing industrial proletariat and the majority population of landless peasants against the parasitic classes that held power under the old regime. This victory, and many like it, has relevance to our understanding of what socialism is, insofar as we recognize the fact that it was victorious, that it succeeded in seizing power and addressing the subjective needs of the people as a whole, of reorganizing and actualizing the demands of society in the face of the old order's inevitable collapse. It was not rooted in any preconceived notions as to what the new society would look like. It did not base itself on any lofty ideals to which the new society would have to strive, but rather it rooted itself in discovering and fulfilling the concrete needs of the people and of society as a whole. This is socialism in the materialist sense. It isn't what one person thinks should happen. It isn't a presupposed system with a blueprint that one only needs to actualize through violent revolution. Its material form differs from time and place based on the subjective needs of the people in those places. Socialism is the movement that seeks to establish a new order that meets the needs of the people, of society. Thus, when one examines history, especially those points in history where socialist and communist parties have seized power and reorganized social relations to better meet the demands of society, it is important to not approach these investigations with a dogmatic understanding of what is and isn't socialist. Rather, we must examine the concrete needs of the people and how they were or were not met. In doing so, we can learn from the past and better understand the path towards the future. This is why Marx and Engels called their socialism scientific, because it was not a fixed dogma, but rather a process of experimentation, success or failure, followed by further experimentation. Socialists must adopt this scientific method, because it is through it that understanding arises and can be acted upon.